Christy, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the I'm Glad We Fit In stamp set from My Favorite Things. So I have stamped those images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Extreme Black Hybrid ink. And I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers to match some pattern paper from the Cartabella Here, There, and Everywhere 6x6. So I'm just going to tear out the print that I am using to pull my color palette from and tuck that under my cardstock panel. So I'm going to start with my critters, and I'm going to do the bear first. I chose E43, E44, and E47. Starting with that E47 and tracing around his face. I'm adding a little more shadow on the right side than the left, just to keep it consistent, since some of the critters have critters overlapping them on the right hand side. So I just did the same thing for all of them. I blended out that E47 with the E44, and then I'm coming in with that E43 and doing little circular motions to break up the edge of that darker color to help that fade. The E43 did push the E44 out a bit too much, so I did do a second layer of the E44 and then also the E43 to smooth out that blend. And then while I have these shades out, I will also use them for my tree trunk. So I'm going back to that darkest shade, the E47, and putting a shadow on the right again to just keep it consistent. And then I'll blend that out again with the mid-tone. Also adding just a little bit of shading to the thinner branches using the very tip of my marker so that I can get in those fine little areas. And then I'll come in with that E43 to fill in the rest of that space. And just like I did with the bear, I will go in with a second layer of the mid-tone and the lightest shade just to smooth things out a little bit more. And then I'm going to move on to the fox, and I'm going to do YR12, YR14, and YR18 for him. A little shadow up on his neck, under his head, and then I'll bring that in on either side of his head with that YR18. Then I'll start to blend that out with the YR14 and just soften up the edge of that darkest shade once again, and then fill in any remaining space with the YR12. The lower part of his face I wanted to color to look white but have a bit of a creamy tone to it. So I went with E50 and E51, and I will let the white cardstock show through for the highlight shade. I also did color the inside of the bear's ears with that E51, and I'll use both of those shades for the stems of the toadstools. And then I'm going to add E53 and E55 to that and use these four shades for the bunnies. For the underlayer, I'm still going back to the E51 and blending out with the E50 and leaving a bit of white space in the center of the face. I'll do this for both of the bunnies, the one in the car and the one in the airplane. And then I'm going to come back in with the E55 and start to add in some little details to make them look a bit unique and give them some personality. So for this first one, I'm going to give him a larger patch on the left side of his face and then a small patch around his eye on the right side of his face. So I am starting with the E55, blending out with the E53, and then using that E51 to finish off those areas. And I did also come in with just a little of the E50 on the bridge between the patches and the rest of his face. And then for the other bunny, I'm going to give him some spots on his ears and a large patch on the right side of his face. So at first I only did one patch on the left ear, but I did decide to go back and add a second patch on the right ear, just a little small one to just make him look even more unique. And then once I'm done with that, I also use the E50 and E51 for the inner parts of the wheels on the car. Then I'm going to switch up to some neutral grays. I'm using N1, N3, and N5 for this critter that's kind of sticking out at the top left of the window. I decided to make him look like a wolf, but I think he could probably be another fox or maybe a dog. The way that he's drawn, it's really open to interpretation. But I started with the N5, blended out with the N3, and then finished with the N1. And then I'm also going to do the little knob that is holding on the propellers with the darker two shades, and then the propellers themselves with the lighter two shades. And then I'll use all three shades for the wheels on the car, adding a bit extra of that N5 to make them look darker. I didn't want to add like extra dark colors. I wanted to keep the color palette pretty simple. So just using a little bit more of that in that area, I think helps translate it to black. And then I'm going to move on to the little bird. I'm going to use some kind of blue-violet tones to match the blue-violet flowers that are in that pattern paper. And I went with BV01, BV02, and BV04, concentrating that darkest color toward the edge of the tail and the tail feathers, and then going lighter toward the face. And I'll come back to that color again for something else later on, but for now I wanted to get my rosy cheeks done. I used R00 and R11 at first, but I quickly noticed that my R11 was dry, so I switched to R02. I really need to sit down and do a marker maintenance day. I'm noticing a lot of my markers are getting dry and need to be refilled, and I do want to take care of that before any damage is done to the markers if they get dried out too much. So I need to do that soon. But anyway, I switched to that R02 and R00, and that worked much better. And then I'm going to keep on with the R shades. I'm going to use R22, R24, and R29 for the car, pulling in that darker coral flower from that pattern paper. The car will be a little bit darker than that, but I think it still pulls in that palette. So I started with the R29 down at the bottom. I'm adding a little bit of shading down at the bottom edge and around the wheels along the back side of the car, and then I brought that up onto the roof and down the front as well, trying to keep that marker really straight so I only get a little bit there. And then I'll also do some shading on the outer sides of the windows and underneath them as well. And then once I have all of that laid in, I'll start to blend that out with my mid-tone, which is the R24. And on that left side where there's not a lot of room, I just went ahead and filled in with the R24. But any areas that are a little bit larger, I'm going to save some room for that lightest shade, the R22. So always just going over the previous shade and catching the edge of that, pulling it into the next shade so that I get a smooth transition for those blends. And then I'm going to finish up this front part, and then I'll switch to the highlight shade, which is the R22. The R22 did not blend as well as I wanted to with the R24. Normally it does, so I suspect that this is also a marker that is running dry. So I'm going to do a little tip-to-tip action here to fix that. But first I'm just laying in that initial layer, and you can kind of see where those two are meeting, that they're not really blending very well. So I will take a little bit of ink from the R24 with the R22 and just use that to color that space in once more and just bridge that gap a little bit better. And that looks so much better to me. It just really helped to smooth out that rough transition. So I wanted the brake lights to be red as they should be, but not the same red as the car. So I took away the R29 and added in the R21. I'll use that combo for the brake lights and also the two mushroom caps. And again, I just switched over to putting this shading on the right hand side to match how I did it with all the critters and the trees. I did kind of switch it up on the car, but I don't think it's super noticeable or looks too jarring. I'm going to move on to some yellows for the plane. I'm using Y13, Y15, and Y17. And I'm going to leave a stripe bare on the wing. I wanted to give it like a two-toned look there. So I'm using that Y17 for the darkest, then blending out with the Y15. And I decided I wanted a little shading above that wing as well, so I will switch back to the Y17 for that and blend that out. And then I'll go on to the Y13 to fill in all of the white space, except for that one stripe. Like I said, I wanted to fill that in with a different color, but I didn't want to have to color over the yellow and then have it not look quite as pure. And I also use those shades for the headlight on the car. Then I'm going to move on to BG10 and BG11 to do the cloud, just adding a little bit of shading on the bottom edge. And I will also add some shading into the inner part of the car as if it's almost like a windshield, although they are poking their heads out. So maybe it's the opposite side that you can see. I'm going to go back to my blue-violet shades, though, that I used on my bird, and that is what I'm going to add to that stripe on the plane's wing. So I just started again with that BV04. I'm blending toward the left with the BV02, and then filling in with the BV01. And I did go back in with a second layer as well, just to make that a little bit darker and give a little bit more contrast, especially on that right hand side, so it looks more shaded. Next, I'm going to move on to the treetop, and I'm going to use BG93, BG96, and BG99. So I've got the BG99 first down at the lower part of the tree, and I'm just flicking that color up. And then I'm going to come in with the BG96 and start to blend that out. And once again, I had a little bit of difficulty getting these colors to blend in easily, so I will have to do a second layer of that to smooth things out. Some colors are just like that. It doesn't hurt to go over a second time. Just make sure that you're using paper that is meant for ink blending so that you don't get any bleed out if the paper gets too saturated. So then I'm going to come in with the BG93 and fill in the top of that tree. And there you can really see how rough that blend is. I don't know if these markers just are like that or if they are also running dry. This isn't a combo that I use very often, but it did match the leaves in the pattern paper, so that's why I chose it. But it doesn't hurt to just do that second layer, like I said, so I'm just going to go in and add that, flick that in from the bottom toward the top, so as the light would be hitting the tree at the top. And then once I have filled all that in, you can see that it is much more smooth and it looks so much better. While I have these shades out, I'm also going to use them for the hill on the left hand side. I'm just doing the same exact motion, and maybe because this was smaller, or maybe because I didn't have to work around the tree branches at the top, this one blended so much easier for me. Then I'm going to switch my greens to G40, G43, and G46 for the other hill, and put that G46 down at the bottom. Just flicking up with those long strokes with the side of my nib so that you cover more ground more quickly. And then I'll come in with that G43, and then fill in with the G40. And again, I wanted that blend to be a bit more smooth, so I did go back in with a second layer on this one as well. Just quickly adding that color in, doing those long flicking motions to make it really quick and easy. And then I'm going to color those grasses with those darkest two shades, just the G46 and a little bit of the G43. Then I'm going to grab a white Sakura Jelly Roll pen and get that started, and I'm going to trace the edges where the purple meets the yellow on the wing just to add a little bit more interest, so it'll be a white stripe in between the yellow and the purple. And I'm also going to add some little polka dots to the caps of my mushrooms. I just think that's a nice look. And then once I'm done with the white gel pen, I'm going to grab my black Sakura Jelly Roll pen and I will get that started. This one is really dry, so it usually takes a little bit to get that flowing. And to be honest, it still wasn't flowing like I'd like. I probably need to replace this. I've said that lots of times and I still keep using it. So I really should replace it soon. But I'm just going to go over their eyes and make them nice and bright and shiny again. It just really brings them to life after the Copic coloring. And then I will trim these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I've got a piece of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock that I've trimmed down with the second largest of the A2 Stitch Rectangle Stacks Set 2. And then I'm going to bring in the MFT Drifts and Hills stencil and some Rustic Wilderness Distress Oxide ink. So I'm just going to hold that stencil firmly in place so it doesn't slide around, and then pull that ink down off the stencil onto the paper. And I will bring in some bundled sage for the bottom just to add a little bit more interest and soften that up a bit. Then I'm going to hold that stencil carefully in place and just slide upward. And I'm going to add in some Hickory Smoke Distress Oxide ink. Now I probably should have wiped off the stencil because this gray is kind of light, and so it did pull some of that Rustic Wilderness ink that was on the stencil into this white space. It's not a huge deal, but it wasn't looking like a road, so I grabbed my black soot Distress Oxide blending tool and just used the ink that was on that and then added a little bit of that Hickory Smoke to it to darken that up. And then I'm going to go up just another little sliver and add in a bit more Rustic Wilderness because I want to create a road between two sides of a hill. Then I'm going to swap stencils to the Cloud stencil from MFT and use some Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide ink. And I didn't go with a darker shade because I wanted to match the blues in that pattern paper. So I'm just making sure to be heavy-handed as I leave that stencil so it makes that cloud really stand out, and then I get softer as I go up the panel to keep it kind of hazy. So I just keep turning that stencil and adding in different cloud formations, and then at that bottom edge I'm just going to add a little bit of extra blue on the sides. The car is going to take up all of the space in the middle, so it wasn't really important there. Before I add my images though, I'm going to stamp a sentiment. I wanted this to be a birthday card, so I'm switching stamp sets. I'm using the Presents and Pupcakes by Yuzu, and I'm stamping out the best birthdays are spent with best friends using some VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And then I'll set that panel aside and pop my card base in my MISTI. I'm using some MFT Snow Cone cardstock and Lawn Fawn Mermaid ink. And I just took two more critters from that first stamp set, and also the sentiment is from that as well. And it says, "I'm so glad to have friends that I fit in with." So now I'm going to go back to that pattern paper pad and find a print to complement it. And I thought this Yellow gingham looked nice. I also liked the yellow polka dot, but I decided to go with the gingham. I thought that added a nice bit of contrast. And then I was trying to decide if I wanted to add a third print, but I decided to just stick with the 2 for this card since you weren't going to see a whole lot of them. It's just a little bit showing on the sides. I trimmed those down to fit the entire card front, so I'll just line that up with the corners and smooth that into place, adding the floral print first, and then I'll add the yellow gingham across the center, just a little bit low. And then I've added some foam tape to the back of my focal panel, so I'll peel off those release papers, and I'm going to line that up in the center of the card. Just trying to make sure that I have equal amounts on both sides, and I'm using that gingham print to help me get that lined up straight as well. I didn't have it quite right the first time, so I just adjusted that. And then I can bring in my images, and I'm going to use the car image to figure out the placement of the tree and the hills. I am going to let those images kind of hang over the outside edge just a little bit, and I am also going to have to trim down a little bit of that second hill because it would have shown underneath the car and kind of jutted out into the road, so we want them to have smooth sailing. So once I have those placed how I want them, I'll just pull out the hills and add some liquid glue behind them and then slide that back into place. And I'll do the same with the tree. Again, just letting those larger images hang over the edges of that focal panel, just the slightest bit, so they're still really well supported, but it just adds a little bit of interest to the scene. It makes it look more expansive. And then once I'm happy with those, I can go ahead and add the car with all of my cute critters. So I'm just going to place them so that they are driving down that road. And now that I have those 3 main images on there, I can start to build out the scene around them, figuring out the placement of these little mushrooms. I'm going to put the smaller one over on the left-hand side and then the larger one over on the right, just because there's more space on the right than the left, so I felt like the wider one made more sense there. And then I've got like a little patch of grass that I'm also going to add on the right-hand side, and then the other one I'm actually going to place down on the lower part of the grass just to add a little interest there as well. Then I'll take the bird and I'm going to have her perched in the tree, just kind of sitting on that branch. And then I want to add the cloud next because my airplane is going to overlap that. I'm going to tuck it back behind the tree a little bit and just make sure I have that right where I want it. And then I can take the airplane and add some glue to that. And I'm going to put that up in that top right corner to kind of fill in the rest of that space there. Just tucking that back behind that other bunny's ear so it looks pushed back in the scene. And then I wanted to add just a little bit of glitter, so I'm going to take my favorite Stardust Stickles and I'll add it to the brake lights and also to the front lights. And I'm also going to put it on the bottom edge of the cloud. And my bottle is running out too, so it's really time to kind of renew my supplies. I think it's been a while since I've replaced any of my basics. But I also put a little bit of sparkle on that purple part of the wing. And that is going to finish up this card. So I'll lift that up so you can see how that catches the light and give you another peek at the inside. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below. I love to get your feedback. And make sure that you ring that notification bell if you haven't, so that you're always alerted when I post a new video. Here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. And I will also have all of the supplies that I used today listed and linked for you in the description bar below in case you'd like to pick up anything for yourself. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have an absolutely amazing day. I'll see you soon in another video. Bye-bye.